chapter 2. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, with the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and will you raise it in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body after he was raised from the dead. His disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. This also is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Imagine a really big event. A really consequential event in the life of the Australian people. Maybe your first thought goes to a Taylor Swift concert in Sydney. Or maybe you look forward very much to a certain rugby league game being played in Las Vegas. And imagine all the people, and imagine all of the activity and the energy and the money changing hands and the expectation, because everyone's there for one reason at a specific time for one thing to happen at an appointed time, and a guy comes along and he just pulls out every power cord he can find. And the Jumbotron goes down, and the lights go down, and the microphones don't work, and everything grinds to a halt. That's Jesus in the temple, right? That is the magnitude of the story we're dealing with here. It might be a bit lost to us. One of the reasons is that we don't really have an appreciation for just how big the temple was in terms of actual size, actual scale, but also how big the temple was in the life and the faith and the understanding of God that people in Jerusalem had. Because God did not reside in the field, or in the house, or in the synagogue, or in your heart. God resides in the temple. And there is only one place to meet Him, and there is only one place to be reconciled to Him, and that is in the temple. So we'll do a bit of jumping today. First we'll jump to the book of Exodus. So God is with His people in the desert, and at some stage He says to Moses, or Moses says to him, "Build me a tent, a tabernacle, so that my presence may come home among you, so that you will never again ask, 'Where is God?' because you will always have the tabernacle, which is the presence of the Lord." And indeed, when the first tabernacle is constructed, the book of Exodus tells us the presence of the Lord came down off the mountain with smoke and lightning and thunder and inhabited the tabernacle. And when they built the temple, first David, Solomon's temple, then that was destroyed. Then the second temple that we have here, the tabernacle itself, that which had been with Israel since the time of the Exodus, that was God's presence, that was situated, built into the temple. To go to the temple in Jerusalem was to be reconciled with God Himself. It could happen nowhere else. And indeed, at the feast of the Passover, everyone is there. The city is in absolute turmoil. People are preparing to celebrate that festival which reminds them of their liberation from Egypt. They are there to purchase lambs without blemish, because what do they have to do? They have to take the lamb, slaughter the lamb, take a branch of hyssop, dip it in the lamb's blood, paint the blood over the lintels and the door frames of their houses. Why? So that the wrath of God, when it comes into town, may pass over their houses. And this they did every year. Now the problem is, in the time of the Exodus, and in the times after that, mostly the people of Israel were agricultural. They were subsistence farmers. Everyone had their patch of land, and they had a few sheep, and they had a few goats, and they had a few cattle. And every year when the Passover comes around, you would go out to your paddock and you would select a 1-year-old lamb. Exodus tells us, Exodus 12, either a sheep or a goat, doesn't matter, but it has to be without blemish. And you would select it, and you would take it, and you would offer it, and you would paint the blood, and you would eat it with the unleavened bread, and Bob's your uncle. But the world changes. People who lived on farms moved to the cities. Sound familiar? They didn't have land. They didn't keep their own animals. But in Jerusalem at the temple, they sold the animals you needed for your sacrifices. They sold cattle. They sold sheep, goats. They sold doves. And you can read the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Numbers to get an idea of just what all those different animals meant in the world of ritual sacrifices. And so people who no longer had their own land, who lived all over the Roman Empire, but who were Jewish in their blood, would travel back to Jerusalem once a year to come and make their ritual sacrifice and to be reconciled with God. And so you would come to the temple and you'd say, well, I no longer keep animals, but I'd like to buy a lamb without blemish. And then what would happen is the temple priests would say to you, wonderful. Here we have a lamb that is completely black for $2, and here we have one that is completely white for $1. And here one that has a mottled skin, and that's $3. And so the guys who were selling these animals did what all good businessmen did. They would change the prices. They would try and make an extra buck. They made it more about buying and selling than they did about sacrificing so that you may be reconciled with God. They hiked their prices up because they knew it was much more convenient to buy your ritual animal at the temple and have it sacrificed there than it would be walking to the other side of Jerusalem to buy it there and then to go back to the temple. Sounds like our own lives, doesn't it? It's much more convenient to have things delivered to your home than it is to go to the shop. There's nothing wrong with that. But when Jesus gets to the temple, he takes the time to braid a whip, and he uses it to chase them all out. The cattle, the sheep, the livestock dealers, the money changers. In the temple, you could only use Jewish money, but people were Romans, and they had Roman money. So you would come to the temple and you would give in your Roman coins, which were unclean, not allowed in the temple of God. And for your Roman coins, you would receive the equal amount of Jewish coins. And Jesus overturns their temples and he throws their coins out and he chases the animals out. And what does he say? What is his concern? He says, "Do not make my Father's house a marketplace." And the Greek word there for marketplace is emporium. No longer a place where you bought a lamb or a dove for the correct price so that you may go through your sacrifice and have your reconciliation, but a place where the best were exhibited, where you had a choice of what color lamb you wanted to buy. And that's the issue Jesus has here. There's nothing wrong with having these animals in the temple. They're supposed to be there. That's part of the temple economy. They have to be there so people can go through their sacrifices. But Jesus says, you have made it more about buying and selling than you have worship. And that is why I am chasing you out. The Jews want to know why he is doing this. What sign do you have? What authority? In our language, you might say, who do you think you are to grind this whole business, and it was a business, to a halt? Jesus, as he often does in the book of John, doesn't really give any answer, does he? He doesn't tell them who he is. He just says, I tell you this, destroy this temple, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. The Jews say, it's taken 46 years to get to this point. How are you going to rebuild it in 3 days? But then his disciples remembered, after his resurrection, what he had said. We'll get to that part after his resurrection. So Jesus is in the temple, and I think in the past we've often read this passage and we've often come away thinking Jesus is against the temple and he's against temple practices, and Jesus is not about religion, he's about relationship, etc., etc., etc. None of that is completely true. There is something Jesus is against, but it's not the temple as such. And to understand what he is against, it might be good discussing what the other people in his time were trying to achieve. You had 3 groups in Jerusalem, in Judea, all vying for political control. You had the Sadducees, and they were the temple guys. The priests and the Levites belonged to them. They controlled the system in the temple. They had very good connections with the Romans, so they knew if everything stays the way it is, then we stay in power, and we like that very much. The Sadducees would tell the people over and over again, the temple is how you are reconciled with God. Keep things in the temple as they are, and you will be okay with God. Then you had a competing group called the Essenes, who lived out in the desert, who did not like the temple practices at all. Their greatest wish was to overthrow the Romans, chase them all out, overthrow the Sadducees, chase them all out, and they would take control of the temple and they would restore correct worship. And the Essenes would be telling people, it is in the desert, it is in isolation, it is in these practices we've perfected in the desert that you will find God, that you will be reconciled with God. And then you had the Pharisees. The Pharisees said, you don't need to be in any kind of isolation. You don't need to live as an ascetic in the desert. You don't need the temple. You don't need to keep all these temple practices. What you need is the law. If you keep the law of the Old Testament, then you will be reconciled with God. So you've got these 3 groups, all vying for power and control. The Sadducees say you need the temple. The Essenes say you need to live a very ascetic life, cut off from the temptations of the world. The Pharisees say you need the law. What does Jesus say? What do we say? There's a word in the book of John, right in the beginning. John chapter 1, verse 14. Where John says, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And dwelt is it's a good translation, it's a fine translation, but there's a better word. It's the word that John actually uses. And the word he uses there changes the meaning slightly, given what we've said about the temple. The Word became flesh and didn't dwell among us, but tabernacled among us. The tabernacle was the one place, the one sign, the one structure that truly contained God's presence, to which any good Jewish person could look and say, that is where my God resides. And John comes and he turns the whole thing on its head and he says, yes, the tabernacle is supreme, but the tabernacle is not a place. The tabernacle is a person. And Jesus is not upset about the dirty cows and the dirty sheep walking through the pretty clean temple. Jesus is not upset about the laws the people keep or the ascetic practices they have. Jesus is upset that people are holding on to these practices and structures when He is literally standing in their midst, telling them the presence of God is here now. And you keep on buying sheep. You keep on buying doves. You keep on religiously keeping all your laws. You keep on isolating yourself from the world. When the Word has become flesh and is tabernacling among you right now. We'll jump back to Ruth's reading. 1 Corinthians. Paul begins his letter and he says to the Corinthians, you'll remember, we didn't come to you with wisdom, with logic, with rationale, with philosophy. We came to you with foolishness. We came to you with something that makes no sense at all. Christ, and if indeed Christ, then Christ crucified. If you've got any kind of philosophical sense, if you've got any kind of business sense, if you are in any way a rational human being, which I suppose if you make it to the age of adulthood, you have to at least in some part be, then the cross makes no sense at all. Then the presence of God among us, being represented by a Roman cross, is the most illogical, foolish thing in the world. And yet, Paul says, it is exactly Christ crucified that is the wisdom of God. A wisdom that does not inhabit buildings and temples and chapels. A wisdom that does not inhabit wise business dealings. You imagine the amount of books that have been written in the last 50 years about being a Christian businessman. Maybe you own some yourself. Paul says, John says, all of that is foolishness. Only Christ is wisdom. There is no business deal or podcast or wisdom that can reconcile you to God. There is Christ and Christ alone. And then the church comes along, and the disciples remember that on a very particular night, not long before his arrest, Nadine, if you'll help me with the table, thank you. Jesus took his disciples into the upper room and he did the most astounding thing. And I sometimes wonder, well, I'm quite sure, thank you. You can sit back down. That when he was doing it and the things he was saying must have seemed absolutely foolish and silly and simple. But when he was gathered with them in that room, after they had eaten, he took some bread, simple, everyday bread. And he broke it, and he passed it to them, and he said to them, "Take, eat. This is my tabernacle. This is my temple. This is my body, broken for you. Take and eat and remember. Remember that I do not dwell in buildings or in places." And after he had given them the bread, he took the cup of wine, and he passed that to them, and he said to them, "Take and drink. This is my blood. This is the blood that forever and all time replaces that lamb's blood on the lintel of your houses. That forever and for all time ensures that the wrath of God will pass you by, and in its place you will receive the unconditional love and acceptance of my Father." Because it's not about places, it's not about doctrines, it's not about dogmas, it's not about teachings, it's not about pastors and chapels and the way we've always done things. It's about Christ. For each and every one of you. Nothing more, nothing less. You know, the most wonderful thing about communion is it's that big. That's the piece of bread. This is a sip of wine, juice in this case. And yet we proclaim, friends, that it is sufficient. More than sufficient. For you to be reconciled with your Father. I'm going to ask John and Hillary